In the previous video, I talked about the element that most designers confuse with the grid system. So whenever you hear a designer say that he or she don't like working with a grid system, what they refer to is this element called document grid. It's these bunch of squares that you can see here on this document. It's not always that you need to work with a document grid, but it's actually great if you have a lot of different elements that you need to place on your document with great precision. For example, a catalog with images, but also great for texts with different letting values if you want them to eventually align, which you absolutely want. The way I'm going to create this video is I'm going to show you a couple of examples after I talk about each element. So professional designers know when to use a document grid and when it's not really necessary. If you want to set up your own custom margins not tied to the document grid when using our plugin, you can create a simulated type area grid, which is basically a document grid but inside the type area, which, as I mentioned, will aid you in placing different elements within your document. One thing I want to mention also is that once you master how to work with the document grid and really make it your slave, that is a sure sign that you are moving on to the next level in your grid system skills. For example, there are different reasons why you might want to manipulate the document grid. One is obviously for editing the baseline grid, since the baseline grid and document grid will almost, if not always, when designed by a professional, align. But another reason, which many don't really consider, is the width of the document grid. For example, let's say you want to have the margins based on the document grid and you have certain desired values for the side margins, maybe 20 millimeters, and the column gutter 5 millimeters. So we want to find a common denominator for these two, and in this case it would be 5 or 2.5 millimeters. Because one of these little squares of the document grid is 5 millimeters, and we multiply it by 4, then we have 20 millimeters. So basically the side margins would consist of 4 squares. And the gutter would consist of 1 square, which is 5 millimeters. Or if the squares are 2.5 millimeters, then they are half of 5, which would mean that we would need 8 squares for the margins and 2 squares for the gutter. So you should consider these small squares as building blocks, and once you get into that mindset, which most designers never will throughout their entire career, then all of a sudden the document grid starts making a lot more sense. Please note that the finer document grid you have, the more flexibility is available. But you don't want to have a finer document grid than needed, because it's about finding a balance and achieving the layout that you desire. It's not about having a million options. In other words, have a basic idea of what you want to achieve before you start. With our plugin, you can stretch, squeeze, and adapt the document grid to fit your specific layout. This is one element that not a lot of designers actually master, so many just don't work with this element and therefore say that they don't work with grid systems, which could not be further from the truth. The sad thing is that if you never work with a document grid, you will never reach the full potential in your layout skills. So let's take a look at the actual document grid itself. So as we can see, it's a bunch of squares going from left to right and top to bottom of the document. Now it's important that the size of the squares of the document grid, basically you need to make sure that all the math is in place. Our plugin takes care of that. So with that said, let's move on here. And as I mentioned earlier, using a document grid is going to help you greatly when you place the different elements, and you want to make sure that you use the same spacing between the elements. So for example, let's pretend that this is a catalog and these gray boxes are images. And by default, when you create a layout, the first thing the plugin is going to do is it is going to apply the document grid, and it's going to make sure that the document grid is proportional to the document. But a problem with that, if you're working with a lot of images, is that the width and height of these squares are going to be different, unless you're working with a completely square document, which is very rare. it's very easy with our plugin to create a completely square document grid. And I'm going to show you how to do that. But I just want to show you these two examples here. So I have two documents. We can see that the height is larger than the width. And I don't think that looks particularly good. So instead, I would like to achieve this. And if I zoom in here, we can see that we have a perfectly square document grid here. So if I just go into preview mode, this looks a lot better than this. If you just look at the spacing on the sides between the images. So let me show you how to create a completely square document grid. So of course I'm going to open the plugin, and if I have a document open, I'm just going to create a new document here. And the first thing I'm going to enter is obviously my leading, my baseline grid. I'm going to enter 12 here, and when I click enter or tab, it's going to create a proportional document grid, which I want to manipulate. So we need to change the unit to points and pixels, because if we look at grid width here, it's always going to look at what is the selected unit, and I want to match it with the leading here. So if I go back to millimeters, it's going to show me it's one of these squares has the width of 3 millimeters. Let's go back to points and pixels. And let's see here. I want to have something as close as possible to 12. I'm going to click on calculate. Now, since we cannot manipulate the, we don't want to manipulate the side margins, the way that I've solved this in this plugin is by manipulating the bottom margin. And what we can do is we can see that the width of each little square is 11.906 points. So that is fairly close to 12. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncheck fit leading, and I'm going to enter 11.096. And I'm going to press tab. Now, when I have this checkbox unchecked, it allows me to set whatever leading I want, but I cannot manipulate this value to anything I want. So we need to use the leading as a value that we will balance it off, or to create a square grid. You get the idea. So I'm going to press tab here. And now we have a baseline grid of 11.906, which is the same as the document grid width. And this is achieved by pushing up the bottom margin start position. Anyway, let's close this and go back to our examples here. Another example where working with a document grid is essential is if you have texts of different leading values and different sizes, and you want all of them to align nicely in the same document. So let's take a look at that. So in this document here, we can see that we have a completely different looking grid or document grid than the other ones. So let's just quickly take a look at the other ones. So we had a proportional document grid, we have a completely square grid, and we have another one here. And the difference here is that I've actually entered the common denominator value that all of the different texts will share. So let me just give you a quick example here. So if we take a look at the body copy here, we can see that it stands on each of these blue lines. And we can see that the baseline grid is 12.027 points as indicated in this field. But the tricky part is that I also want my caption text to eventually align with this baseline grid. And the way to do this is to find a common denominator value. So let me give you an example. Let's say that I want my body copy to have a baseline grid of 12 points, and I want my caption text to have something around 9 or 8 points. Then I would have to play around, and eventually I will find a common denominator value, which is a value that they share in common that can be multiplied. And that value in this case is 4 points. So if we look at this little square here, This is, let me just go ahead and change this to points. This is 4.009 points in height. So if I multiply that by 2, then I have 8.018 points. And if I multiply it by 3, which I've done here, I've entered 4 here, which is one of these little boxes, or the height. And then I multiply it by 3. That gives me 12.027 points. So, with that said, I'm also going to quickly show you my headline here and my subheadline, which are based on the baseline grid. So basically what I've done is I've just multiplied the baseline grid value. So if we go to paragraph character styles, we can see that my body copy here has 12. So if we go to caption, we can see that it has the value 8.018 points. So basically, if we look at this second group here, it's all about multiplying these tiny little squares, the smallest square. And if we look at this first group here, it's all about multiplying the distance between the two blue lines, which is the baseline grid. And that's what I've used. I've used this group for my larger text and this group for my smaller text. So if we continue and go to headline here, we can see that I've multiplied it by 5 times. You can also use a custom leading value here and set whatever value you want yourself. So one last example before we move on to the next element is the ability to set up your own margins, your own custom margins, and then set up a document grid, or actually it's a type area grid within the type area, which is the space within the margins. So basically the way to achieve this is by checking these boxes called value in the margin setup, and then you enter your own values here. And then you simply go to custom setup and you enter the number of lines that you want. And if you want a more complex layout, let me go ahead and close this and let me show you this example. To achieve what I showed you here with having multiple baseline grid values and so on, what you do is you just edit this subleading value. So that's it for the document grid, and I hope you realize just how valuable this element is and that you don't neglect it. All designers should know what a baseline grid is. Basically, it starts from the top of the document and ends at the bottom of the document. Or if you work with fixed margins, not based on the document grid, then the baseline grid will begin from the top margin and end at the bottom margin. The tricky part that most designers will struggle with is calculating a baseline grid that fits in both of these scenarios. Our plugin will easily calculate the perfect baseline grid value in both of these scenarios. A baseline grid is what you place your body copy on. It will ensure that your text is aligned across multiple columns. So let's take a look at that. For our first example, let's look at this document that I got open here. And if we go to the top of the document, we can see that our baseline grid starts there. And if we go to the bottom, it ends nicely. And there is no misalignment or anything like that in this example. And the same if we go to this example. So basically you can decide if you want to work with a baseline grid that begins at the top of the document and ends at the bottom of the document, and this is going to be based on the document grid. Or you can also define custom margin values and have your baseline grid be set inside of these margins. In either case, the baseline grid is going to be calculated perfectly in these scenarios. So let's take a look at this here. It starts at the top of the margin and ends at the bottom of the margin here. And finally, this example here, we can see that we have some text that goes across these 3 columns. And there is no kind of misalignment or anything like that. And this is because our plugin will automatically set align to grid to all lines, which means that it's going to snap every single line in each paragraph to the baseline grid. Now, if I go ahead and I select first line only, it is only going to align the first line of text in the paragraph to the baseline grid, and everything after that is going to hang freely, or let me show you what I mean. So basically you don't see anything now because 12.027 points is actually the exact distance between each line here for the baseline grid. But if I go ahead and I change this, it's going to look really weird here. You can see that this line of text is still locked on to the baseline grid, but everything after that sort of just looks horrendous. But that is because it is applying the leading value of 21 points from the first line to all the other lines, and this is going to cause misalignment across the different columns here. So, but if I go back and I change to all lines here, let's see what happens. It's going to snap to the closest baseline grid. So if I go ahead and I change this to, let's try 11 here, let's see what happens. It's still closest to 12.027 points. And once I start going above that value to the next value, for example, 12, and then we have 13, then it's going to jump to the next line. So in theory, if I go beyond 24 something, it should jump to the line under, if you know what I mean. Check this out. See? So every 12.027 points something, then it jumps to the next baseline grid. So a baseline grid is very important to make sure that your text is aligning across the columns here. Margins consist of the space between the document edges and the type area. It is also within the type area where the majority of the content will reside. Whether you wish to base your margins on the document grid or custom values, it can easily be set up using our plugin. Now I'm going to show you where the margins are. You can see this black area here. This is where the margins are. And where this red area is where the type area is. Columns are created when you split the type area horizontally. The space between the columns is called gutter. Setting appropriate column widths is crucial for legibility. You don't want your lines of text to be too wide or too narrow. Either your eyes will struggle to focus on the long lines of text, or your reading experience will be very bad as you will constantly need to jump from one line of text to the next one. When the reading naturally flows throughout the content, then you have set an appropriate column width to font size ratio. Obviously, the font size and baseline grid plays a major role when setting the width of columns. Let me show you where the columns actually are. So if I select this layer here, we can see two black boxes, and these are actually the columns. And if I select this, it's going to bring forth a red little box, and this represents the spacing between the columns, which is called gutter. I want to show you something here. In InDesign, it's actually possible to right-click on the document here or the page and deselect Lock Column Guides. And if you then go to the Direct Selection tool, you can actually modify the column width and move around the gutter wherever you want it. So let's say that you would like to have a column that has less width than another column, then you can use this tool. However, this is not something that you want to do because it will result in a lot less flexibility. So what you want to do instead, the right way of working with columns, is to have enough columns that you can play around with different combinations. I've set up a couple of different combinations here. And this is actually a 12-column grid, which is quite common, especially amongst magazine design. And what this allows you to do is to allow you to create different combinations. So for example, if we take a look at this first page here, we have 3 columns and then we have 9 columns. So in the base we have 12 columns, but because 12 is such a flexible number, it's going to allow us to create all kinds of different combinations. So for example, here we have 6 columns by 6 columns, and then 5, 5, 2, and then 4, 4, 4, 1, 4, 4, 3. And you can play around until you're happy. But the problem is, if you use the method that I showed in this document here, where you move around the column gutter and edit the column width, then you do not have that option. So you want to stay away from that. You want to make sure that you use enough columns for the different setups that you're going to use in your document. Rows are the same thing as columns, but it divides the document in the vertical space. Working with rows is not needed as often as the other elements that I have mentioned. With that said, it is a great element that can take your layout to the next level when it is needed, as it adds another dimension. Most designers will think that rows are only needed when you work with images, for example, a catalog, but that is not true. Rows can be used to indicate certain positions in the document. Let me explain. Say you set up a layout with 5 rows. In the first 2 rows, you will have your headline and subheadline. Starting in row 3, your body copy could start, and so on. If you want a row of different height, then use the same method as I showed you for the columns. Image lines is probably not something you will find anywhere outside of our plugin. Basically, it's all about aligning text with images. What our plugin does is to set up guides in a separate layer based on the lowercase x or uppercase h or a custom value. Image lines are a great aid in ensuring that your alignments are perfect. With our plugin, the image lines will automatically update if you edit the body copy, which the image lines are based on. So I did some editing to my document, and now I'm back here in InDesign, and I'm going to show you how it actually works. Let's zoom out here and let's take a look at the plugin here. So in paragraph and character styles, you have the option called image line. So if I uncheck this, it's going to delete this layer called image lines. And also, obviously, it's going to remove it from the document. To apply it, you simply check this box here. Let me zoom in here and show you. So right now we have image lines applied based on the lowercase x height. If I go ahead and I change it to the uppercase h height, then it's going to apply exactly that. And if I go ahead and I change the font size, it's going to redraw the image lines on the document. And even if I change my font style or my font, doesn't really matter. It is going to automatically adjust this setting. And this is going to save you hours, and it's also going to help you to create beautiful alignments with your text and images, as I just said earlier. But let me show you how to actually apply images in the correct way. So let me go here and show you. I've already placed a little black box here to represent the an image. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you begin your image on one of these guides here, and that you end it at the actual baseline grid. And the reason for that is because we want to have an alignment at the bottom with the text, and we want to have an alignment with the top of the text as well. So if I just zoom in here, we can see that we have the perfect alignment between the X and the image itself. So this is how you should work when you align images and text. And that's it for this little video series. I hope that you liked this video. Please post a comment, like this video if you did, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.